Guyana has long been a land of unfulfilled promise. It was once thought to be the home of El Dorado, and later a place where one could find gold and strike it rich. Instead, it became a sugar plantation economy controlled by the Dutch and later the British, and which has had tumultuous politics from the 1950s on. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history of Guyana. We know little about Guyana's first inhabitants. Historians estimate that they may have arrived in the area as early as 35,000 years ago. What is clear is that by the time the Europeans showed up in the late 1400s, what is now Guyana had two main groups of indigenous people, the Arawaks and Caribs. The former lived mostly along the coast, while the latter lived in the interior. They called the area Guyana, which translates to land of waters, a very appropriate designation since the region is not just full of bodies of water, but is bounded by the Amazon, Negro, and Orinoco rivers. Historians estimate that both the Arawaks and Caribs originated somewhere in the South American hinterland and migrated northward. They shared some traits like the fact that neither had complex hierarchical social structures, and cassava was the main food staple for both. But while the Arawaks were peaceful cultivators, hunters, and fishermen, the Caribs were bellicose and would constantly raid their neighbors for wives. The first Europeans to see the Guyana coast came with Christopher Columbus in 1498, during his third voyage to the Americas. Having attempted no settlements, they did not leave much of a mark except for the naming of the Essequibo River, the largest in the country, a moniker derived from the name of Juan de Esquivel, one of Columbus's lieutenants. There would be further Spanish exploration along the Guyana coast by Alonso de Ojeda in 1499, a voyage that also included Juan de la Cosa and Amerigo Vespucci, further cementing the Iberian claims to the region. But busy with the Antilles and the conquest of Mexico, the Spanish would make no serious attempt at settling the area. Instead, it would take until the 1590s for interest in the region to be revived, largely as a result of Sir Walter Raleigh, who in 1595 and then in 1617 led large expeditions to the area in search of El Dorado. He found little more than a cause for his execution. Raleigh had been under strict orders to avoid conflict with the Spanish in his 1617 expedition, so when some of his men attacked present-day Ciudad Bolívar, he was put to death for disobeying the king when he returned to England on October 29, 1618. Still, Raleigh's exaggerated account of his first trip in 1595 had convinced Europeans that the land abounded with gold, and so 2 years before his second expedition, the Dutch established the first settlement in what is now Guyana, a trading post they called Essequibo, set 25 kilometers upstream from the mouth of the river of the same name. 3 years later, the Netherlands created the Dutch West India Company, a charter institution with a trade monopoly in the Caribbean and jurisdiction of the Atlantic slave trade, which was also given complete control over the area, including all future settlements. The Dutch would then continue to expand along the rivers in the following decades, especially as the original aim of trading with the natives was superseded by actual control of the territory once other European powers gained colonies elsewhere in the Caribbean. The most important of these was built in 1627 on the Berbice River and would be ruled separately along with Essequibo well into the 19th century. A third one, Demerara, would be included as an independent colony under the control of the Dutch West India Company over a century later in 1745. In the meantime, the persistent problem of Spanish claim to the region, who kept sending periodic patrols to destroy Dutch outposts, was eventually solved in 1648 with the Treaty of Munster. The agreement, part of the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War, committed the Spanish to recognize not just the breakaway Republic of the Netherlands, but also its overseas territories. The Guyanese colonies soon moved beyond trade and concentrated on agricultural products, especially tobacco early on and later sugarcane. It was a profitable business, but there was one major problem: lack of labor. Unlike Spanish South America, the Dutch could not enslave the natives or force them to work, because not only was there fewer of them, but they could also escape into the bush more easily. And so, like other Europeans, the Dutch turned to kidnapped Africans as a major source of labor. Their numbers grew quickly. By the 1660s, there were already 2,500 of them, and a much higher number than the free white population. The conditions the enslaved Africans faced were brutal, which led to over half a dozen revolts. The largest, in 1763, was also the first. Led by Kofi, an Akan man from West Africa, it began in a plantation on the Kanje River and lasted for over a year, threatening Dutch control of the Guianas. In the end, though, troops from neighboring colonies and divisions within the rebellion led to it being crushed, with some of its leaders being burned alive, while Kofi reportedly committed suicide. Every subsequent revolt was also suppressed with brutal efficiency, preventing the creation of runaway maroon communities in marked contrast to nearby European colonies from Brazil to Jamaica. The Dutch welcomed traders and settlers from other colonies, especially in Demerara, after 1746. This led to an important inflow of sugar planters and enslaved blacks from various British colonies such as Barbados, where soil depletion was beginning to affect yields. Strains began to appear between the planters and the Dutch West India Company in the 1760s, however, and they got worse after the latter tried to raise taxes at several points in the 1770s to make up for the higher cost of government. Things deteriorated even more in 1781 when war broke out between Britain and the Netherlands as a result of the American Revolution. This then led to a brief British occupation of the Guyanese colonies, and then, after the Dutch allied with them, a French one, which lasted between 1781 and 1783. During that time, the French constructed a new settlement at the mouth of the Demerara River that they called Longchamp. When the Dutch regained control of their colony in 1784, they opted to move their capital there and renamed it Stobrecht, after the president of the Dutch West India Company. The restoration of Dutch authority brought back the grievances against the charter company, however, so the Netherlands decided to place the Essequibo and Demerara colonies into a single administrative unit under direct royal control, while Berbice retained its colonial charter status. This gave more say to the planters in government affairs, and it might have paved the way for a less fraught relationship between the Dutch and their Guyanese colonies, but the French Revolution intervened. In 1795, French revolutionary forces occupied the Netherlands, creating a client state called the Batavian Republic. In response, as the British went to war first with revolutionary France and later with Napoleon, they occupied the Guyanese colonies from 1796 to 1802 and once again in 1803. Once post-Napoleonic Europe emerged, the Netherlands and Britain set out to negotiate their new reality, and in 1814, the Guyanese colonies were formally ceded to the British. Life in Guyana under British rule did not change much in the first 2 decades other than the renaming of the capital from Stabroek to Georgetown in honor of King George III. But then 2 major events occurred that had long-term consequences. The first was the unification of Berbice with the Essequibo Demerara colony to create British Guyana in 1831, and the second was the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, which became law in 1833 but did not take effect until 1834. This not only created a significant free black population in the colony, but also created the conditions for future labor flows that would significantly shape the future of the country. The newly freed population tried to run abandoned sugar plantations or create cooperative ventures, but within 20 years their efforts had failed. This reflected the fact that running sugar plantations required substantial labor and capital because of the threat of constant flooding, which required a complex network of seawalls, dams, and drainage canals that could be gated at high tide and opened at low tide to allow the outflow of excess water to the sea. So rather than return as wage laborers to the hated white-owned plantations, they moved to the towns and villages, making up the basis of a new urban working class. Some of them also tried their luck looking for gold in the interior, contributing to the rugged image of the port knocker, a kind of prospector. The planters, meanwhile, turned into indentured labor to try to make up for the worker shortage. Generally set up for 5 years with an additional 5 years working in Guyana necessary to receive free passage back home, the planters first brought Europeans like English and Irish, and especially Portuguese from the Madeira Islands, then Chinese, and finally Indians. The brutal conditions meant most groups immediately moved on. The Portuguese in particular shifted to the retail trades as shopkeepers, pawnbrokers, and so on, which they would soon dominate. This in turn made them a target whenever economic conditions made it difficult for people to pay their bills, and so there were anti-Portuguese riots in 1856, 1889, and 1905. In the meantime, the planters finally found suitable population for their purposes: Indians. The first indentured people from the Asian subcontinent began arriving in British Guiana in 1838 and would continue to come for nearly a century. Between then and its abolishment in 1917, there were an estimated 239,000 Indians, about 16% of which were Muslim. Their numbers were large enough they would become the second largest ethnic group in the country, a rural proletariat that would end up in conflict with the Afro-Guyanese, the largest group which concentrated in cities. During this period, there was also the persistent problem of a border dispute with Venezuela. The Treaty of Munster in 1648, which had formalized Spanish recognition of the Dutch colony, had only acknowledged as Dutch territory the land east of the Essequibo River. But over the years, the Dutch and later the English kept expanding west. This was exacerbated in the late 1850s when gold was found in the area, bringing even more British settlers. Venezuela protested to no avail. Eventually, they appealed to the United States, claiming this was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The American president, Grover Cleveland, found this persuasive, and in 1897 forced the British to agree to the Treaty of Washington, an arrangement where both sides would agree to the appointment of an international panel with 2 Americans, 2 British, and 1 Russian, who would presumably be neutral, and who would determine the boundary between British Guyana and Venezuela. In 1899, the International Tribunal ruled mostly in favor of Britain, granting them nearly all the disputed land except the mouth of the Orinoco River. The Venezuelans were furious and argued that the British had improperly influenced the Russian arbitrator, but it was all for naught. To this day, they continue to claim about 2/3 of Guyana. The dominance of sugar planters in the country's politics began to diminish by 1900. First, East Indians discovered the possibilities of rice cultivation, which could liberate them from the sugar plantations, and provided them with the opportunity of acquiring land of their own, making British Guiana an exporter of rice in the first years of the 20th century. Second, sugar estates began to consolidate in order to maintain profitability in the face of massive competition from the European beet sugar industry as a result of British free trade policies. Third, bauxite was discovered near Linden, and the Demerara Bauxite Company was established to exploit it, creating an option for the development of the interior, which the new Guyanese middle class began to argue was the future of the country. And finally, there were major constitutional changes in 1891 that enlarged the electorate and changed who could govern. At the time, the colony was ruled by 3 main government bodies: the Court of Policy, which had legislative and administrative functions, and 2 courts of justice, which resolved judicial matters that were brought to them by petition. Both were controlled by the planters throughout the 19th century, but in 1891, reformers convinced the British Crown to lower property requirements for membership in the Court of Policy, to enlarge it so that at least half would be directly elected, and to relax qualifications for voters. This meant that by 1915, about 4,300 people were entitled to vote. Of these, more than 60% were of African descent, just under 20% were of British parentage, about 11% were of Portuguese descent, and only 6% were of East India ancestry. The change in power dynamics brought conflict, especially after World War I, when those in the black middle class that had gone to war gained prestige back home and insisted on changes. This led to yet another change in 1928, when the British government announced that the country would become a crown colony with a legislative council which would replace the previous Court of Policy, a type of government that would be more closely controlled by London. This created resentment, which was then exacerbated by the Great Depression, which would lower the prices of the country's major exports: sugar, rice, and bauxite. Faced with a massive economic downturn, Guyana, like the rest of the British Caribbean, would see major labor unrest and violent demonstrations. The British established the Moyne Commission in response, a major report that aimed to investigate the causes for the unrest and provide solutions. Published in 1939, it recommended an expansion of the electorate, more self-government, and government spending to sustain the Guyanese economy. World War II intervened, however, so there was little change until 1951, when universal suffrage was introduced and a bicameral legislature was created. In the meantime, the 2 most important Guyanese politicians of the 20th century, Cheddi Jagan and Forbes Burnham, came to prominence during this time. Jagan was trained in the US as a dentist. His experience there and his marriage to Janet Rosenberg inspired him to take up liberation of his country as a cause based on the premises of Marxism-Leninism. When he returned to Guyana, he immediately joined forces with the nascent trade unionism, was elected to the Legislative Council in 1947, and founded the People's Progressive Party, or PPP, in 1950, an originally broad and multiracial organization that is still one of the 2 major parties in the country. He was joined as a founder by Forbes Burnham, a London-trained lawyer also with Marxist sympathies that would eventually also found the other important party in the country, the PNC, or People's National Congress, after internal disagreements within the PPP led to the split in 1958. The first election under the new constitution in 1953 led to a surprising PPP win thanks to its popular proposals, but when they tried to enact their agenda, especially the passage of the Labor Relations Act, the British became convinced British Guyana could become a communist puppet under the PPP, so they decided to suspend the colony's constitution and send troops to quell potential turmoil. Jagan was then removed, and an interim government was instituted, which lasted until new elections were called, which the PPP also won. Cheddi Jagan became the colony's premier once again, with a government that, although relatively moderate, masked serious political divisions as political parties became polarized along ethnic lines, with the PPP retaining the majority of Indo-Guyanese and the PNC becoming the party of Afro-Guyanese, especially after Jagan vetoed British Guyana joining a potential West Indies Federation. In 1960, there was also the creation of another party, United Force or UF, a conservative outfit with strongest support among the Portuguese community in Guyana. For the next 3 years, the UF and PNC carried out a destabilizing campaign with riots, strikes, and protests aimed at toppling the government. Implemented with American support given their distaste for Jagan's Marxism, the instability brought about not just destruction in the tens of millions to Georgetown, but also ethnic violence and the death of hundreds throughout the country. The colonial secretary, Duncan Sandys, tried to quell the turmoil, calling for fresh elections under a new proportional representation system favored by the UF and PNC, in the promise that the new government could then negotiate the country's independence. The PPP got the most votes once again, but they could not manage an absolute majority, so the UF and PNC united to create a coalition government that made Forbes Burnham prime minister, a position he would hold for nearly 2 decades. Burnham's government regained some stability, saw some growth in the economy, and oversaw the transition to independence. On May 26, 1966, British Guyana officially became Guyana. A brighter future seemed possible. But the relative peace did not last long. First, there was an insurrection in 1969 known as the Rupunini Uprising, where several hundred indigenous rebels attacked a city in the interior of the country. It seems Venezuela might have supported the revolt in exchange of the Esequibo's return, but if it did, it was a complete disaster. It only took hours for the Guyana Defense Force to crush it. Indigenous peoples would continue to be at the margins of the country's politics. Next, Forbes Burnham, once considered more moderate than Jagan, declared Guyana to be a cooperative republic. That is, a country that followed Marxist precepts, became friendly with Cuba and other communist countries, and transformed itself into a leader in African liberation movements. It also became increasingly authoritarian, and elections were rigged. This was especially so after the Declaration of Sofia in 1974, in which Burnham proclaimed the nationalizations of Guyana's industry and the merger between his party, the PNC, and the state. Now, any public good or service would depend directly on party membership. Still, Burnham did not have complete power. There was opposition, most notably the Working People's Alliance, or WPA, a multiracial left-wing outfit, but Burnham continued to consolidate his power in any way he could, such as when he modified the Constitution to change the legislature to a unicameral system and the president be both the head of state and head of government, a position he would then hold for another 5 years. Politics during this time continued to be violent. There were a number of assassinations, most prominently that of Bernard Dark, a Catholic journalist killed in 1979 by a cult associated with the regime, and Walter Rodney, head of the WPA, who was killed with a car bomb in 1980, presumably by orders of the president. Things might well have continued on this path, but the sudden death of Forbes Burnham, after having throat surgery in Cuba in 1985, put Guyana on a different course. The PNC would still rule the country for another 5 years under the leadership of Desmond Hoyt. His government would retain some authoritarian tendencies, but political pressure finally forced the government to open up, and in 1992 had its first free and fair elections in decades. This paved the way for the return of the PPP, who have won every election since then, except for the 2015 to 2020 term election, when David Granger won with an alliance that included the PNC as the major party. Turmoil hasn't left Guyanese politics entirely. In 2018, Granger refused to abide by a vote of no confidence and challenged it in the courts until he was finally forced to call for new elections in March 2020, which the PPP won once again, but not before Granger's government tried to manipulate the results to put himself in office. Nonetheless, after months of wrangling, a recount was carried out, and on June 8, 2020, Irfaan Ali was declared the winner, making him the first Muslim president of Guyana. Meanwhile, the Guyanese economy has been growing in recent years, especially after 2007, when a UN tribunal settled a dispute with Suriname that allowed offshore oil exploration, dramatically increasing the country's GDP. But this was only the beginning. In 2015, a new rich oil field was found with the kind of wealth that could completely transform the country. And thus, once again, Guyana has become the land of promise, although problems remain, not least because of their border dispute with Venezuela. Will this be a real El Dorado for the country? Only time will tell.